lobbying for peace is a dirty word. But if you decide that you want to preserve your privacy and make sure all the data that goes in and out of your computer is encrypted, then check out NordVPN. My affiliate link will give you something like a 2/3 discount on some of their packages. Well, Gordon, on the Israel-Gaza conflict, and also I think it's pertinent to what our country's doing in Yemen and what our country's doing with Ukraine, that they're all support our governments, and the Labour Party are going to do the same. They're supporting war instead of lobbying for peace. Nobody lobbying for peace. Actually, no, that's not true. The ones that are lobbying for peace, like Orban and Galloway and Robert Fico, they're the ones who are vilified, smeared as Putin puppets, and in Fico's case, get shot. Like, lobbying for peace is a dirty word. The tragedy of what? 500,000 Ukrainians being slaughtered for what? Because Boris Johnson scuppered a peace deal which would have preserved Ukraine's borders, which would have honored the Minsk agreement and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Never mind how many thousands of people have been injured or handicapped or disabled, and the problems caused by Ukrainians fleeing the country and then ending up in other countries and causing all sorts of issues there, because peace is a dirty word. It's disgusting. And then in that instance, it becomes incumbent upon us to do what we can to promote peace when our governments aren't going to be doing that. And you and I have done a couple of videos about why in the UK, and in fact, any country that's a signatory to genocide, against genocide, not for genocide, or against terrorism or the financing of terrorism, it is illegal to pay tax.
And this is any country. I think this is within the ICC's remit, right? It was joined up to that's the Rome Statute. Is that right?
It's the Rome Statute, and also the United Nations Conventions on Financing Terrorism, against genocide, against terrorism. So that says that it's illegal. And I'll link to this in the description below, and people can find out about it. bit.ly/makewarhistory will take you to the website, which is actually geared for the British situation, but it's similar in all the other countries that are signatories to the UN Charter and these statutes, these treaties, that it's against the law to give money to any agency or organization that's going to use that money for acts of terrorism or acts of genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity. And that includes British government's actions in Yemen, supporting Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, supporting the conflict in Israel, because it's not what we want our tax money to be used for. I'm going to share with you a letter that it's anonymous, and it's been sent to HMRC. So someone's been using the process on propertycode.com, bit.ly/makewarhistory, go to either, which essentially, it's very simple if people don't know, right? So using trust law, and trust law is older than the Magna Carta. It's older than the 1688 Bill of Rights. So it's very, very embedded within the British legal system. And it's probably the same in all common law jurisdictions, which would be the Commonwealth countries, the United States, because they inherited the British legal system as a function of imperialism. Anyway, so what this person did and what people can do is, here's a trust document. You can have the proceeds, HMRC, the primary beneficiary, they can have the tax that's due, provided they can demonstrate that they're not violating the provisions of the International Criminal Court Act and the Terrorism Act. And they need to do so by a certain time. If they fail to do so, then the money will go to the secondary beneficiary, the secondary beneficiary using trust law, which can be the original taxpayer, or it could be somebody else, but not HMRC.
A local charity.
A local charity, that's right. The Workers' Party or the Heritage Party can be anything. Any cause that you support could be somebody else, a neighbor or whatever, right? And then, so this person did that, and then they've been in exchange with HMRC, where HMRC said to them, look, we've reached an impasse. So unless you have any more questions, I'm not going to respond. Now, what was interesting in that letter, which I've seen, is there's no threat of escalation. They're not saying, we're going to take you to court. They're not saying, we're going to refer this to our debt department, debt collection department. They just say we've reached an impasse. Here's an example of an
This
impasse.
is what happens. Sorry, Rich. This is what happens with um, people using common law in court, isn't it?
I don't
Where
know.
the judges sort of like they were going after people for council tax, and what people understood was if you just present your birth certificate, that is the person basically that you have gone into a contract with, and as long as they're in the room, then nothing can be done against this person. In the end, the judges walk out because they've reached an impasse, and then the steward in the court says, "Well, I'm the person now. Okay, we'll dismiss the case." So is it the same sort of
This is
dealio as that?
different. So one that the whole thing about I don't quite understand the person thing. It's from the Interpretation Act, where person legally means um, a body's corporate or incorporate. It doesn't refer to a living human being. And one of the things I did do an interview with an expert on common law and went through the Education Act and the Children's Act. There's no reference to man or woman or son or daughter.
It's interesting, that is, isn't it?
They use legal terms, but not
And
those.
these are the same sort of loopholes that Chris was telling us on the podcast that we did
But
with him,
what?
that the rich use to avoid paying tax as well, isn't it?
Yes,
It's the
they
same
use
sort
trust
of
law.
loopholes they use.
They use trust law to avoid paying tax, but the probity co method relies on statute, which is not common law. It's after
Right.
common, right? So let me share my screen.
Yeah, two separate things. It's just that you mentioned the impasse thing, and it was noteworthy to me that that happens in this other sort of system as well.
Yes, yes. Well, the just on the personhood, apparently personhood got created after the Great Fire of London in I can't remember the name of the act, but it was written in French. And that's where they created the birth certificate system as a form of identification and created them as corporate entities. Okay, so this is the letter. Thank you for your letter of 29th of April. In that letter, you said you had nothing more to say in the matter, but would respond if I had any further questions. That's encouraging because I do have questions. These are below. Now, I may post this on my Telegram group, and I'll pass it on to you, Gordon, if you want to post it on your
Yeah,
Telegram.
please do, because whoever this person is, I want to. This is interesting.
My intention is in this letter, as in my previous correspondence, is to ensure that I'm acting consistent with statute. Now, I deal with legal issues as a social worker. So I have
Right,
some understanding, right? And this is really clever because what they're saying in writing is that they want to pay taxes that are legally due. So
right.
they're asserting their intention to act legally. And that by doing so, I do not fall foul of the provisions of the International Criminal Court Act, the Terrorism Act, and the Accessories and Abettors Act. Now, in previous correspondence and in the trust deeds, it says what the specific statutes are and gives references. And here they're not given here. There is one or two, right? But the Accessories and Abettors Act is 1861. It says something like, if I'm an accessory to a crime, if I support a crime, then I am as guilty of that crime as the perpetrator of the crime.
Yeah, if you give somebody a gun and then they go and shoot somebody, and you knew that they were going to shoot this person, then you are going to
I'm a
prison.
party to that criminal act. I hope by getting these questions answered, we can move to a speedy resolution of this matter. Numbered my questions, they're in bold. The
This is
matter
so good.
The matter of belief, you stated in your letter to me that you can see that my complaint is based on my beliefs. I've made it clear previously that I'm not making a complaint. Mine is an inquiry to establish the legality of providing funds to an agency whereby some of those proceeds will be used for aiding, abetting, or facilitating acts of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of terrorism as defined in International Criminal Court Act and the Terrorism Act. Why do you keep relating to this matter as a complaint?
Because they don't want to deal with this. They don't want to deal with the actual
Inquiry,
point
right? They don't
that
want
is
to answer
being
the
made.
question. Yep. Next one. I've already stated that my queries are not based on my beliefs, a point that you accepted in your letter to me of 12th March. I've said nothing whatsoever about my personal philosophical or religious beliefs in my correspondence. The issues that I've raised are to do with common law, trust law, the rules of equity, and statute. What is your evidence that I'm refusing to pay based on my beliefs when all I've done is raise matters of legality? There is no evidence. So this person, keeps refuting that it's to do with beliefs. And by doing so, should it go to court, HMRC can't say, oh, it's because of their beliefs. No, they keep saying, look, is to do with the law and legislation. Will you?
I know judge worth their salt is going to rule against this, because then they will be a party to this too, and they want to follow the law and not whether somebody's saying that this is based on beliefs. No, it's based on the law. It's not a belief.
Right. That's right. Will you continue to raise the issue of my presumed beliefs and thus continue to misdirect from the actual issue at hand? What is your evidence that I'm refusing to pay? I've already settled the CGT via trust. From now on, you must correspond with the trustee of the trust. As I've stated before, as the settler, so this is a bit of trust law. So this
Yeah.
person settled their accounts by handing them over to the trustee, which can be themselves, but they're now acting as the role of the trustee who imposes conditions which the primary beneficiary must fulfill. And where
And
this is
then,
from is
so sorry, are they just sending this letter to the person rather than the trustee continuously?
yes, well, they're
They're
replying to
not
this.
dealing with the trustee then.
No, they're not.
They're
No,
still dealing with the person.
no. And one of the conditions on the trust was that it had to be, they had to demonstrate that they were acting within statute by a certain time,
Right.
right? They're now pursuing it after that time has passed. And what they're saying here, the author's saying here, is this is already settled in trust law, according to trust law. As I've stated before, as the settler, my concern has been to ensure that neither I, HMRC, or its personnel are violating the provisions of these acts. So what's your evidence that I'm refusing to pay? They say, when they've already settled via trust. HMRC's obligation. So in their letter, in your letter, you state that HMRC is not obligated to provide proof of the points that I've raised. Does HMRC have a duty to be transparent and to act consistent with statute? What protections are in place to ensure that HMRC and its personnel are not acting illegally and are not demanding that I act illegally? Now, one of the things that's occurred to me when I was reading this, and the author doesn't reference the Fraud Act. It's illegal. It's a violation of the Fraud Act to make a misrepresentation or to use a position of authority illegally to cause another to have a loss or to make a financial gain. So perhaps in a further letter that could be considered. Does HMRC and its personnel have the power and authority to demand that I take action that violates statute? By the way, again here, reminder here, if you want to know more about this, right, in this process, go to probitycode.com. Does HMRC have a commitment and or a policy with regards to transparency, accountability, and integrity? If yes, please do send me the policy document that outlines HMRC's policy regarding this. I'm sure that will be a riveting read. If HMRC does not have to provide proof of compliance with legislation, does that mean that HMRC can pick and choose which aspects of law and legislation that it abides by, which it ignores and which it breaches? I mean, what they could have also said here, right, is HMRC a rogue organization like the United States?
Honestly, they really could have.
That's right, or like the US
Is
DOJ.
MRC above international law? Really?
Well, they can't be above national law, surely, right?
True,
Because
right?
we're talking about national statutes. Does this also mean that I will not know what laws or statutes that HMRC is ignoring, sidelining, or breaching? Could also say abiding by as well here, right? Now, this was interesting because they said HMRC had said, you suggested I meet with my MP about the way the government spends its tax receipts. That would be relevant if I wish to campaign for a policy change. However, I do not wish to change government policy in
Want
this
to make
regard.
sure that I'm not a party to it. Yeah, right.
I want to ensure that the existing policy in the form of these acts is being honoured. That is not a matter for my MP. Rather, it would be a matter for the police, as violations of these acts are criminal offences. Parliament and the Supreme Court have already determined through these acts what needs to be done when it comes to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorism. I just wish to ensure that those statutes are honoured. Is it not incumbent on HMRC, its personnel, and myself to ensure that we act consistent with those statutes? Put another way, does HMRC have a duty to operate according to the principles laid out in these acts? 12. For my next question, I remind you of the following. This act, this is from the International Criminal Court Act 2001, Section 78. This act binds the Crown and applies to persons in the public service of the Crown and property held for the purpose of the public service of the Crown as it applies to other persons and property. So this means no one's exempt. So just like this act applies to you and I, Gordon, it applies to persons in the public service of the Crown and it binds the Crown.
So you mean like Her Majesty's Revenue or His Majesty's Revenue and Customs?
That's right. That's right.
That's
And
what that HMRC stands for, isn't it?
that's right. And it applies to persons in the public service of HMRC. Perhaps I've got it wrong and misunderstood whether or not the International Criminal Court Act applies to HMRC. So for the sake of clarity, please let me know if HMRC is exempt from the provisions of the International Criminal Court Act 2001. Are HMRC employees and agents that act on its behalf exempt from this act? Are you, Mr. So-and-so, exempt from the provisions of the International Criminal Court Act 2001 in your role as an agent of HMRC? He's not. Go back here. Persons in the public service of the Crown. He's not exempt. Similarly, now, Chris Coverdale has said to me that as taxpayers, we have a duty, this person would have a duty to report Mr. So-and-so, because Mr. So-and-so is raising money that this taxpayer has cause to believe is going to be used for acts of terrorism. And what the UK Royal Navy is doing in Yemen is qualifies as terrorism within the statute of the Terrorism Act 2000. Similarly,
would us, just out of interest, would us like supplying the weapons to Saudi Arabia to do its like 7-year genocide on Yemen constitute that as well? Because this has been going on for longer than the last few months. This has been going, our proxy war with Yemen has been going on years.
Absolutely, it qualifies because you're facilitating terrorism and genocide. Similarly, is HMRC, its employees and agents exempt from the provisions of the Terrorism Act and the Accessories, Aids and Abettors Act 1861? So can they, for example, can they facilitate crime, like the example you gave, give somebody a gun, knowing that it's going to be used for murder, and they're not subject to the law? Am I exempted from the provisions of these acts? Please note, I am not complaining here, nor am I arguing for a policy change. I'm merely seeking clarification on how HMRC is or is not implementing statutes that have been passed by Parliament. This includes the International Criminal Court Act, which Parliament has clearly stated applies to the Crown and applies to persons in the public service of the Crown. Does this provision apply to HMRC and its agents, or has Parliament exempted HMRC, its agents, and its employees from the provisions of the International Criminal Court Act? Now, he's saying the same thing many, many different times, he or she, right? Let me say something about that. I was in court a few months ago in a child custody case and contact case, whether these children were going to have contact with one parent and how much contact or not, right?
Yeah.
And I was grilled by the father's barrister, the mother's barrister, the independent social worker's barrister. The judge asked me a couple of questions, and the local social services barrister. The social services barrister went light on me because we agreed, right? The mother's barrister kept asking me this question that I didn't want to answer because the answer wouldn't have favored my argument and my perspective. So I can't remember what the question was, but so I skirted the question. I avoided answering it. So then the barrister asked me again. So then I avoided answering it. So the barrister asked me again, and it got to the point I couldn't avoid answering it. I just couldn't. So this person is doing the same thing here, asking the same question in different ways to ensure, well, to try and get an answer out of HMRC. All you have to do is provide me with the exemptions or overrides that say that I'm not bound. I and HMRC are not bound by trust law, rules of equity, International Criminal Act, Terrorism Act, and Accessories and Abettors Act. Why won't you provide me with those details?
Because they can't, because they will be an accessory.
There is a maxim in British jurisprudence that we're all equal under the law. Therefore, we are all bound by trust law, rules of equity, common law, and statute. Now, a maxim is like a principle that applies in law. We're all equal under the law, right? So please tell me, does this maxim apply to HMRC and its employees? Apparently not. Doesn't apply to Joe Biden or Barack Obama. Setting aside the matters of statute, I now turn to trust law and the rules of equity. My understanding is that this matter has been settled as HMRC was the primary beneficiary of the deed of trust through which the matter of the CGT claimed has been paid. Why do you keep raising this issue when the matter has been settled according to trust law? Is HMRC exempt from trust law and the rules of equity? If so, how is it exempt? If it is not exempt, then the matter of CGT has been, capital gains tax has been settled as it has been paid by deed of trust. If it is exempt, could you then refer me to the appropriate provision by which HMRC is exempt from trust law?
No crumbs left on the table with this letter, was there?
No, HMRC is not exempt. If you personally do not know the answers to some or all of the questions that I've asked, could you ask the solicitor's office? Now, that's the division in HMRC that deals with this, right? Surely they would know, right? My commitment and my role. As I stated previously, I've already settled the CGT due by paying it into trust. I did it this way as I wanted to ensure that I was not violating the provisions of these acts by paying HMRC funds that will be used for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorism. Am I exempt from the provisions of these acts when giving money to a government agency when some of those proceeds will be used for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and acts of terrorism? Because HMRC, in their responses, from what I understand, to this person, keeps saying we have a legal duty to collect income tax. They say nothing about whether this person is violating those
Mhm.
statutes. Above other questions that I have, I think answering them with appropriate references will allow for this matter to be resolved promptly. Unless you can state in writing that I, HMRC, its agents and employees, including you, Mr. So-and-so, are not bound by the provisions set out in the International Criminal Court in these acts, please stop asking me for payment for funds that are used to aid, abet, facilitate genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and acts of terrorism. Your repeated requests for such payments are just evidence of illegality on the part of HMRC, its agents, and its employees.
And you, Mister What's His Face, you,
That's right.
you,
That's right.
you.
Now get this, my invoice. In my letter to you dated 5th of March 2024, I said that I reserve the right to invoice HMRC for the time taken to respond. Subsequently, in my letter of 8th of April, I sent you an invoice for £500, charged at a rate of £100 an hour, which I think is less than a solicitor charges.
That's reasonable, actually. £100 an hour. That's quite reasonable.
This was payable within 28 days of receipt by check. The first invoice is unpaid. I enclose it again with an additional invoice for this letter, charged at the same rate of £100 an hour. Since this letter also took me 5 hours, this second invoice is for £500, which is also payable within 28 days. Please note that I reserve the right to add late payment fees at a rate
I
that
was
I
going to say that you need to add charges on the back of that, mate. That's just yeah. But he's followed it up. Go on, well done, son.
that I shall determine. I have given you fair warning of my intention to invoice you. You have not refuted or challenged me on my rates or on my invoicing you. Now, there's a principle in common law called silence by acquiescence by silence.
Yeah.
If they haven't objected, then they're
Yeah.
acquiesced. So you've not refuted or challenged me on my rates or on my invoicing you. I reserve the right to pursue a claim in the small claims court should these invoices remain unpaid. And then get this. I assure you that by making payments due in the invoices, none of those funds will be used for genocide, war crimes, humanity, or terrorism.
You see, that's how easy it is, HMRC. Look, paying. I love it.
It's brilliant,
If you
absolutely
pay
brilliant.
this person, you will not be committing a crime. We promise you.
Well, yeah, they keep saying in this letter, look, I want to act legally. I want to act legally.
Yeah.
So then I don't know. I don't know what HMRC will say to this, but what are they going to do? Take it to court? Fine. They got all this evidence.
Okay, I mean, you're right. A judge is not going to rule against this guy. He's got all these ducks in a row,
Right. So then I don't know what HMRC can do.
or shouldn't, rather.
I don't know because more and more people are discovering this process because more and more people are pissed off and upset about how our government and Labour are going to be much worse, and we can talk about that next, right? Our government are using our hard-earned tax money, our hard-earned money for committing mass murder, instead of using it for taking care of our own, of addressing homelessness or improving the health service or schools or whatever, God forbid if you want your kids to go to school, right? But instead of those sorts of things, taking care of our own, we're killing people abroad. That's not, and that's why tax originally came about anyway. But here we have an opportunity to object, and we can also, some people may think they may support the war, right? For whatever reason, right? They're on different side of the fence, but they may object to the Great Reset. They may object to the government spending money on CBDCs, in which case they can still use this process, or they might just want to not pay tax because they need more money to deal with the cost of living crisis, which this government has deliberately caused. And I'm referring to the Tory government, and the Labour government will be much, much worse because they're more WEF than the Tories. So propertycode.com or bit.ly/make war history. And you can find out more and watch my videos and watch Gordon's videos on this. Gordon, do you know?
Don't worry, Rich. They're not going to commit any war crimes. They're just going to send all your kids to do them for you.
Oh God.
You know,